just 20 years old, Lucy Granger was thrown out into the freezing night with nowhere to go, no family, no money, and no place left to call home. But while wandering alone through the mountains, she discovered a hidden cabin on the cliff, and inside was a secret fortune that would change her life forever. What she found that night didn't just make her rich. It revealed a heartbreaking secret that had been buried for years and connected two completely broken strangers in a way neither of them could have imagined. Stay until the end, because this story proves that sometimes losing everything is exactly what leads you to the miracle you never saw coming. Lucy Granger had learned a long time ago that people could stop loving you without warning. At 20 years old, she stood alone beneath the flickering neon sign of a closed gas station on the edge of a forgotten Colorado town, hugging her thin jacket tightly against the freezing night air. Snow drifted softly across the empty highway while passing cars sprayed dirty slush onto the sidewalk beside her boots. None of them slowed down. None of them even looked at her. Just 3 hours earlier, Lucy had still believed she had somewhere to sleep. But after another screaming argument, her foster father had thrown her backpack onto the porch and locked the door behind her. No goodbye, no apology, only silence. Now, everything she owned rested inside that worn-out bag beside her feet. 2 sweaters, a toothbrush, an old photograph of her mother smiling beside a lake Lucy barely remembered. The edges of the picture were bent from years of being unfolded during lonely nights. Her stomach ached from hunger, but it was the emptiness in her chest that hurt most. Because deep down, Lucy wasn't crying over losing a home. She was crying because she had finally realized she had never truly had one. And somewhere beyond the dark mountain roads ahead, fate was already pulling her toward something that would change her life forever. The temperature dropped fast after midnight. Lucy Granger sat curled beneath the rusted awning of the abandoned gas station. Her knees pulled tightly against her chest as icy wind swept through the empty parking lot. The storm rolling over the mountains had grown worse, covering the highway in freezing rain and patches of snow that glittered under the weak streetlights. She hadn't eaten since that morning. Every few minutes, she checked her phone, hoping for a message that never came. No friends asking where she was. No foster family calling her back. No one looking for her at all. Her battery finally died just after 1 o'clock. The black screen reflected her pale face for a brief second before disappearing completely. Lucy swallowed hard and slipped the phone into her pocket, trying not to let panic rise in her chest. But it was impossible to ignore the truth now. She was alone. Completely alone. A pickup truck roared past the station, tires hissing across wet pavement. For a moment, Lucy looked up hopefully, thinking maybe someone might stop. But the truck disappeared into the darkness without slowing down. She lowered her head again. The cold was becoming unbearable. Her fingers trembled violently, and her soaked sneakers no longer protected her feet from the freezing ground beneath her. She knew she couldn't stay there until morning. Small mountain towns like this weren't kind to homeless girls wandering the streets after dark, especially girls alone. Lucy forced herself to stand. Pain shot through her stiff legs as she slung her faded backpack over one shoulder and stepped away from the gas station. The road ahead curved toward the mountains, disappearing into dense forests and steep cliffs swallowed by fog. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving. The farther she walked, the quieter the world became. Soon, the town lights vanished completely behind her, replaced by towering pine trees and the sound of wind moving through the canyon. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto her cheeks like tears. Her stomach twisted painfully from hunger. At one point, Lucy spotted a diner near the roadside and hesitated outside the glowing windows. Families sat inside laughing over hot meals while steam fogged the glass. A little girl around 6 years old sat in a booth beside her mother, smiling as she dipped fries into ketchup. Lucy stared for a moment too long. The mother noticed her standing outside. Their eyes met. Lucy quickly looked away and kept walking before the woman could say anything. Shame burned hotter than the cold. She hated the way people looked at homeless girls. Not with cruelty most of the time. Worse, with pity. By the time she reached the old mountain road leading deeper into the canyon, exhaustion had begun clouding her thoughts. Her body felt heavy, each step slower than the last. Then she saw the sign. Warning, unmaintained trail, no trespassing. The faded metal sign leaned crookedly beside a narrow dirt path partially hidden behind overgrown brush. Lucy stopped. Wind howled softly through the trees above her, while darkness stretched endlessly between the cliffs ahead. The trail looked dangerous, barely visible beneath tangled roots and loose rocks. But farther down the highway there was nothing. No lights, no buildings, no shelter. Lucy glanced back toward the distant town one final time before stepping past the warning sign. The trail climbed sharply upward through thick forest. Wet branches scraped against her jacket as she pushed deeper into the mountains. Several times she nearly slipped on loose gravel, catching herself against tree trunks with shaking hands. The storm continued building overhead. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the canyon. After nearly 20 minutes of climbing, Lucy's legs finally gave out beneath her. She stumbled against a large rock beside the trail and collapsed onto the cold ground, breathing hard. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Not loud sobbing, just quiet, exhausted tears from someone who had spent too long pretending to be stronger than she really was. "I'm trying," she whispered brokenly into the darkness. The words disappeared into the wind. For several minutes, she stayed there curled against the rock, fighting the urge to simply lie down and stop moving altogether. That was when she noticed it. A faint glow. Lucy lifted her head slowly. Farther up the mountain, barely visible through the trees and falling rain. A warm, golden light flickered for only a second before disappearing again. Her breath caught. At first, she thought exhaustion was making her imagine things. But then the light appeared again. Small, distant, real. Someone was up there. Hope surged painfully through her chest so suddenly it almost hurt. Lucy pushed herself upright and grabbed her backpack again. Her legs trembled violently from fatigue as she continued climbing toward the light. The trail narrowed the higher she went, forcing her dangerously close to the edge of steep drops hidden beneath darkness. Wind whipped through the canyon hard enough to make branches groan overhead. Still, she kept climbing, because for the first time that night, she no longer felt completely abandoned. The light grew brighter as she approached, and then finally, through the fog and pine trees, Lucy saw it. A small weathered structure hidden high against the cliffs. Its windows glowed softly against the storm like a lantern in the wilderness. Lucy stopped breathing for a moment. The place looked almost unreal standing there alone among the mountains, isolated from the world below, as if it had been forgotten decades ago. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney into the freezing night air. Someone was inside. Lucy stared at the cabin with wide, uncertain eyes, while rain dripped from her hair and fingertips. Fear whispered at the edge of her thoughts, but the cold was stronger than fear now. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped toward the narrow wooden porch, and with every step closer to that mysterious cabin hidden deep within the cliffs, Lucy unknowingly walked toward the secret that would change her life forever. Lucy Granger stood frozen at the edge of the porch. rainwater dripping from her sleeves as the storm raged through the canyon behind her. Up close, the cabin looked even stranger. The structure clung to the cliffside as though it had been built directly into the mountain itself. Parts of the walls were made from dark, aged wood, while the back disappeared into solid stone. The windows glowed faintly amber, but no movement appeared inside. No voices. No footsteps. Nothing. Lucy swallowed nervously and stepped closer to the door. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. What if someone dangerous lived here? What if they called the police? Or worse, what if whoever lived here didn't want strangers finding this place at all? Thunder cracked above the mountains. The freezing wind cut through her soaked clothes hard enough to make her shiver violently. She had no choice. Lucy raised her trembling hand and knocked softly against the wooden door. No answer. She waited. Only the sound of rain. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Her stomach tightened with disappointment. Maybe the cabin was abandoned after all. Maybe the light she saw had only been a lantern left burning inside. Lucy glanced back toward the dark trail behind her. The storm had grown worse. Fog rolled through the cliffs so heavily she could barely see the path anymore. If she left now, she might not make it back down safely. Slowly, she reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily beneath her fingers. Unlocked. The door creaked open. Warm air immediately spilled across her face. Lucy hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The cabin was small, but strangely beautiful. A fire still crackled softly inside a stone fireplace near the far wall, casting orange light across the room. Old books lined rough wooden shelves built into the stone. A thick woven blanket rested neatly across a leather chair beside the fire. But what struck Lucy most was how untouched everything felt. Not abandoned. A paused, as if someone had walked out only moments ago. A kettle rested above the fire. Steam no longer rose from it, but the metal still looked warm. Lucy slowly removed her soaked backpack and placed it near the door. Her entire body ached from cold and exhaustion. "Hello," she called quietly. No response. She stepped deeper into the cabin. The silence felt heavy, almost watchful. On one wall hung dozens of framed photographs. Most showed mountains, lakes, forests, and old mining towns. But a few featured the same elderly man standing beside expensive buildings, suited businessmen, and newspaper headlines Lucy couldn't fully read from across the room. Whoever owned this place had clearly not always lived alone in the mountains. A sudden creak behind her made Lucy spin around. Nothing. Only the storm pressing against the windows. She exhaled shakily. Then she noticed something strange. Near the fireplace sat a polished wooden desk covered in papers and journals. One drawer near the bottom had been left slightly open. Inside, something metallic reflected the firelight. Curiosity slowly overcame fear. Lucy approached carefully and pulled the drawer open farther. Her breath caught instantly. Stacks of cash, neatly bundled, hundreds of dollars at a time. For a moment, Lucy simply stared, unable to process what she was seeing. Her mind immediately assumed it had to be fake, but when she reached down and touched one bundle, the paper felt painfully real beneath her fingertips. There had to be thousands of dollars inside that single drawer alone. Lucy stepped backward instinctively. Fear hit her chest all at once. People didn't hide money like this unless something was wrong. Very wrong. Her eyes darted nervously around the cabin again. Who was this man? And where was he now? A sudden gust of wind slammed against the side of the cabin hard enough to rattle the windows. Lucy flinched violently. That was when she heard it. A faint sound somewhere deeper inside the cabin. Not outside, Inside. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. Lucy's blood ran cold. The sound came from behind a narrow hallway carved into the rock wall near the back of the cabin. She backed away immediately, panic flooding through her exhausted body. Every terrible possibility rushed through her mind at once. An armed stranger. A criminal. Someone hiding from the law. The footsteps grew louder. Lucy grabbed her backpack instinctively, ready to run back into the storm if she had to. Then a figure slowly emerged from the darkness. An elderly man. Thin, gray-haired. One hand pressed painfully against the stone wall for support. The old man looked shocked to see her standing there, and Lucy looked equally shocked by him. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The man's eyes moved from Lucy's soaked clothes to her trembling hands and pale, exhausted face. Something in his expression changed instantly. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition, as though he knew exactly what kind of pain she carried before she even spoke. "You shouldn't be out there tonight," he said quietly. His voice was rough with age but strangely gentle. Lucy opened her mouth, but no words came out. The emotional weight of the entire night suddenly crashed into her all at once. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the fear of having nowhere left to go. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered shakily. "I didn't mean to break in. I didn't have anywhere else." The old man stared at her silently for a moment longer. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward the open drawer filled with money. Instead of panic or anger, a faint sadness crossed his face. He looked back at Lucy again, and quietly said something that would change both of their lives forever. "Neither did I." The fire crackled softly between them, while the storm howled against the cliffs outside. And somewhere deep inside that hidden cabin, two completely broken strangers unknowingly stood at the beginning of a story neither of them could yet understand. Lucy Granger sat silently near the fireplace, her hands wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic mug the old man had given her. It was the first warm thing she had touched in nearly 2 days. The heat stung her frozen fingers at first, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was still alive. Across the cabin, the elderly man moved slowly but carefully, placing another log onto the fire before lowering himself into the chair opposite hers. The soft orange glow illuminated the deep lines across his face, lines carved there by stress, regret, and years of solitude. For a while, neither of them spoke. Rain hammered the cliffs outside while wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the cabin creak softly against the mountain. Lucy kept glancing nervously toward the desk drawer filled with money. The old man noticed. "You're wondering why it's there," he said quietly. Lucy hesitated before nodding. The man gave a faint, humorless smile. Most people would have grabbed it and run. Lucy looked down at the mug in her hands. "I thought about it," she admitted softly, "for maybe 2 seconds. The old man studied her carefully after that. Not suspiciously, almost sadly. "What stopped you?" Lucy swallowed hard. Then came the answer before she could hide it. "Because if someone has to hide money in a place like this," her voice trembled slightly, "they're probably just as lonely as I am." Silence filled the cabin again. The old man leaned back slowly in his chair, staring into the fire as though her words had struck someplace deep inside him. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "My name is Walter Hayes." Lucy nodded quietly. "Lucy Granger." Walter repeated the name softly, almost thoughtfully. Then he asked the question no one had asked Lucy in years. "How old are you?" 20. Walter's eyes lowered briefly. Too young, his expression seemed to say. Far too young to already look this exhausted. The storm outside intensified, while Lucy slowly explained how she had ended up wandering the mountains alone. She spoke carefully at first. Embarrassed by parts of her life she usually avoided discussing: the foster homes, the constant moving, the feeling of never truly belonging anywhere long enough to unpack emotionally before being forced to leave again. But something about Walter's silence made her continue. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't offer fake sympathy. He simply listened. And for someone like Lucy, that alone felt unfamiliar enough to hurt. When she finally mentioned being thrown out earlier that night, Walter closed his eyes briefly. "They said I was a burden," Lucy whispered, "that I ruined everything around me." Walter stared into the fire for several seconds before speaking. People say cruel things when they want to justify abandoning someone. Lucy looked up at him. There was no pity in his voice, only understanding. For the first time since entering the cabin, Lucy noticed something else about the old man. The loneliness here wasn't accidental. It lived in the walls, in the silence, in the untouched photographs lining the shelves. Every object inside the cabin felt carefully preserved, like pieces of a life someone couldn't let go of. Her eyes drifted toward one framed picture sitting alone beside the fireplace. A younger Walter stood beside a woman with bright eyes and dark hair. Between them was a little girl smiling at the camera while snow fell softly behind them. The photograph looked old. "Loved?" Lucy glanced back toward him carefully. "Your family." Walter followed her gaze. For the first time that night, genuine pain crossed his face. Yes, he didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. The grief in his eyes answered enough. Lucy looked away respectfully, but Walter surprised her by continuing. "My daughter would have been close to your age now." The words landed softly in the room. Heavy, fragile. Lucy didn't know what to say. Walter stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the canyon below. His silhouette darkened against the storm outside. "I built companies," he said quietly. "Real estate, investments, resorts. People used to fight for invitations to my parties." A bitter smile touched his face. Funny how quickly success disappears once tragedy enters the room. Lucy remained silent. Walter rested one hand against the cold glass. 10 years ago, my wife and daughter died in a car accident during a snowstorm not far from these mountains. Lucy felt her chest tighten instantly. After all the pain she had experienced herself, she still couldn't imagine surviving something like that. "I lost everything after that," Walter continued, "not financially, emotionally." The fire crackled softly behind him. "My business partners saw weakness. Family members fought over money before the funerals were even finished." His jaw tightened. "Turns out grief makes people uncomfortable, especially when it lasts longer than they think it should." Lucy lowered her eyes, because she understood that feeling too well. People only tolerated sadness when it was temporary. After that, they wanted you fixed. Quiet. Convenient. Walter turned slowly back toward her. "So I disappeared." Lucy looked around the cabin again with completely different eyes now. Not as a strange hideout, but as a wound, a place built by someone trying to survive the unbearable. "You've been here alone all this time?" she asked softly. Walter nodded once, long enough to forget what normal life feels like. Something shifted inside Lucy then. Until that moment, she had seen Walter only as a mysterious old man hiding from the world with secret money buried inside the mountains. But now she saw something else. A father. A broken human being. Someone who had once loved deeply and lost everything afterward. And somehow, sitting across from him beside that fire, Lucy no longer felt like the only abandoned person left in the world. Walter walked back toward the desk slowly. Then, after a long hesitation, he opened another drawer and removed a small velvet box. Inside was a silver necklace with a tiny snowflake pendant. "My daughter's," he said quietly. Lucy stared at it carefully. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he held it. "I used to think keeping all of this hidden meant I was protecting myself." His voice lowered. "But maybe I was really just hiding from life." The room fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. And for the first time in years, two strangers who had entered the night believing they were completely alone slowly began realizing they had both been searching for the exact same thing. Not money, not shelter, but someone who understood what it felt like to lose everything. Morning arrived slowly over the mountains. Thin streams of pale sunlight slipped through the cabin windows, cutting across the wooden floor while the storm clouds finally began retreating beyond the canyon. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucy Granger woke somewhere warm. For several seconds, she didn't move. She simply lay beneath the heavy wool blanket Walter had given her, staring at the ceiling while the crackling sound of the fireplace drifted softly through the cabin. The night before almost felt unreal now. The storm, the mountain trail, the hidden cabin. Walter Hayes. And yet the warmth surrounding her was real enough to make her chest ache unexpectedly. Because deep down, Lucy had forgotten what safety felt like. She sat up slowly. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and burning cedar wood. Somewhere nearby, old vinyl music played softly through static, low enough to blend with the wind outside. Lucy followed the sound into the main room. Walter sat near the window with a steaming mug in one hand and a stack of papers spread across the table beside him. Morning light revealed how tired he truly looked, the deep shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the careful way he shifted whenever he stood. But despite all that, something about him seemed lighter than the night before. As if speaking out loud about his grief had loosened a weight he'd carried alone for years. "You're awake," he said gently. Lucy nodded. Walter slid a plate toward her across the table. Eggs, toast, bacon. Simple food. But to Lucy, it looked like a feast. "Thank you," she whispered. Walter only gave a small nod before returning his attention to the papers in front of him. Lucy ate slowly at first, embarrassed by how hungry she really was. But after the first few bites, her body took over. She hadn't realized how close to exhaustion she'd been until warmth and food finally reached her system again. Walter pretended not to notice. That kindness somehow hurt more than pity ever could. After breakfast, Lucy helped clean the dishes despite Walter insisting she didn't need to. The rhythm felt strangely natural, like something from a life she'd never gotten the chance to have. A normal morning, a safe home, a father quietly reading by the window while coffee brewed nearby. The realization nearly broke her heart. Later that afternoon, Walter asked if she wanted to see something. Lucy followed him through the narrow hallway carved into the mountain stone behind the cabin. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. At the end of the corridor stood an old steel door hidden behind shelves of tools and storage crates. Walter hesitated before unlocking it. "I haven't opened this room in years," he admitted quietly. The heavy door creaked slowly inward. Lucy stepped inside and froze. The room beyond looked nothing like the rest of the cabin. It was larger, modern, hidden beneath the mountain like a secret vault. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with locked boxes, old documents, paintings wrapped carefully in cloth, and rows of sealed containers. In one corner sat several antique chests beside a large safe built directly into the rock. Lucy stared speechlessly. Walter watched her reaction silently. "This," he said quietly, "is what everyone spent years trying to find." Lucy turned toward him slowly. "The money?" Walter nodded once. "Part of it." He walked farther into the room, his footsteps echoing faintly against the stone floor. "After my family died, I sold almost everything publicly. Businesses, properties, investments." His expression darkened slightly, but not all of it. Lucy looked around again in disbelief. "How much is here?" Walter gave a faint, tired smile, enough to make dangerous people interested. The words sent a chill through her. Walter opened one of the safes slowly. Inside were stacks of documents, property deeds, bank certificates, gold coins sealed in protective cases, and several thick envelopes. Lucy had never seen wealth like this in her life, not even close. For someone who had spent nights counting coins just to buy gas station sandwiches, the room felt almost unreal. But what shocked her most wasn't the money. It was Walter himself. He didn't look proud. He looked exhausted by it. "This place became my prison," he admitted quietly. "At first, I told myself I stayed hidden because people only cared about what I owned." His eyes lowered slightly, but eventually I realized I was using grief as an excuse to disappear from the world. Lucy remained silent, because part of her understood exactly what he meant. Pain could become a hiding place if you stayed inside it long enough. Walter walked toward a small wooden cabinet near the far wall and removed a sealed envelope. On the front, written carefully in faded ink, were the words, "For the person who finds this place when I'm gone." Lucy's breath caught. Walter stared at the envelope for several long seconds before handing it to her. "I wrote that 3 years ago," he said softly. Lucy looked confused. "Why?" Walter smiled sadly. "Because deep down, I think I knew someday someone would arrive here needing this place more than I did." Her fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. "I don't understand." Walter looked directly at her then, and for the first time since meeting him, his expression carried something close to peace. "When I saw you standing in that doorway last night," he said quietly, "I saw someone who looked exactly how I felt after losing my family." Lucy's eyes immediately filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, just quiet emotion too deep to hide anymore. Walter continued softly, "You weren't staring at the money, Lucy." He glanced toward the fireplace room behind them. "You were staring at the warmth." The word shattered something inside her. Because he was right. All she had wanted was somewhere safe enough to stop feeling unwanted for a little while. Walter stepped closer and placed a small key into her hand. The metal felt cold against her skin. "I think life brought you here for a reason," he whispered. Lucy stared down at the key silently while emotions twisted painfully inside her chest. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't throwing her away. Someone was opening a door for her instead. And neither of them realized yet that the choice Walter Hayes was about to make would change Lucy Granger's future forever. The days that followed felt unreal to Lucy Granger. For the first time in years, she woke up without fear sitting immediately in her chest. No yelling through thin apartment walls. No foster parents reminding her she was temporary. No anxiety about where she would sleep the next night. Only silence, warmth, and the strange, peaceful rhythm of life inside the mountain cabin. At first, Lucy kept expecting it to disappear. Every morning, she half believed Walter would suddenly change his mind and tell her to leave. Trauma had trained her to expect kindness to expire quickly, but Walter never asked her to go. Instead, little by little, he began making space for her in the life he had hidden away from the world. It started with small things. A second mug placed beside the coffee pot each morning, An extra blanket folded neatly near the fireplace before bedtime. Quiet conversations during dinner instead of silence. And somehow, those tiny gestures affected Lucy more deeply than the fortune hidden beneath the cabin ever could. Because money could solve hunger, but kindness healed something much deeper. Weeks passed. The harsh mountain winter slowly softened into early spring. The snow along the canyon edges melted into narrow streams, while sunlight lingered longer across the cliffs each evening. And with each passing day, Lucy slowly began changing. At first, the changes were almost invisible. She slept through the night without waking from panic dreams. She started brushing her hair again instead of hiding beneath oversized hoodies and exhaustion. The permanent tension in her shoulders gradually eased. Walter noticed everything, but wisely he never pointed it out. Healing, he understood, frightened, wounded people almost as much as pain did. One afternoon, Lucy found herself standing outside the cabin, staring across the canyon, while cold wind moved softly through the pine trees. Walter stepped onto the porch beside her. "You're thinking too much again," he said calmly. Lucy gave a small embarrassed smile. "I'm not used to this." "To what?" She hesitated. "Being wanted somewhere." The honesty of the answer hung quietly between them. Walter looked out across the mountains before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "after my family died, I spent years convincing myself isolation was strength." A faint sadness crossed his face. "But eventually loneliness stops protecting you. It starts consuming you." Lucy lowered her eyes slightly, because she knew exactly what he meant. Loneliness changed people slowly, quietly. It taught you to expect rejection before affection, to apologize for existing, to leave emotionally before someone else could leave first. Walter rested one hand against the porch railing. "You don't have to survive anymore, Lucy." She looked at him uncertainly. "I don't know how to do anything else." The old man smiled sadly. "That's the problem with survival mode. After a while, you forget you're allowed to live too." The words stayed with her long after he went back inside. That night, Lucy stood alone before the bathroom mirror inside the cabin. For several seconds, she barely recognized the girl staring back at her. Not because she looked beautiful, but because she no longer looked completely broken. Her cheeks carried color again. The dark circles beneath her eyes had faded slightly. Even her posture had changed. For years, Lucy had walked through life trying to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. But now something unfamiliar was happening. She was beginning to exist again. A few days later, Walter handed her a small stack of papers while they sat near the fireplace. Lucy frowned slightly as she looked through them. Bank forms, identification applications, housing records. "You need your life back," Walter said quietly. Lucy looked up immediately. "I can't ask you for that." "You didn't." "But the money," Walter interrupted gently. "The money isn't saving you, Lucy." He leaned back in his chair. "You are." Tears immediately filled her eyes again. Not because of the wealth, because nobody had ever spoken to her like she mattered before. "Nobody," Walter continued softly. "I spent years thinking wealth could protect people from pain." He glanced toward the hidden room beneath the cabin, but pain walks through locked doors very easily. Lucy wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed. Walter pretended not to notice. That became one of the things she loved most about him. He protected dignity carefully, especially hers. As spring deepened across the mountains, Lucy slowly began helping around the cabin more naturally. She repaired loose boards on the porch, organized old shelves, cooked meals, and even convinced Walter to clear out rooms he hadn't entered in years. The cabin itself began changing too. The silence inside it no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. One evening, while sorting through old storage boxes, Lucy discovered dozens of unopened letters addressed to Walter from charities, shelters, and community organizations. Most were requests for donations. Some dated back nearly a decade. Walter looked uncomfortable when she asked about them. "I stopped believing money helped people," he admitted quietly. Lucy studied the letters carefully. Many were from youth shelters, programs for abandoned teenagers, runaway support centers, girls exactly like her. Something shifted inside Lucy as she read them, because for the first time in her life, she realized something terrifying. If she had never found this cabin, no one would have come looking for her. The thought stayed with her all night, and sometime after midnight, Lucy finally understood what the hidden fortune truly represented. Not luxury, not power, possibility. The next morning, she found Walter sitting alone near the window, watching sunlight spill across the canyon. "I want to do something with it," she said quietly. Walter looked at her carefully. "With what?" "The money." A long silence followed. Then slowly, Walter smiled. Not the sad smile Lucy had grown used to seeing. A real one. Small, warm, hopeful. And in that moment, Walter Hayes realized something extraordinary. The frightened, homeless girl who had arrived at his door during a storm was no longer simply surviving. She was becoming someone capable of changing lives, including his own. Summer arrived quietly in the mountains. Wild flowers bloomed along the canyon trails, soft purple and yellow spreading across cliffs that had once looked cold and lifeless to Lucy Granger. The air no longer carried the sharp cruelty of winter winds. Instead, sunlight poured through the trees each morning, warming the porch of the cabin that had slowly become the first real home she had ever known. And somehow, almost without realizing it, Lucy had changed with the seasons. The frightened girl who once stood trembling outside Walter Hayes's door with nowhere left to go had begun disappearing little by little. In her place stood someone stronger, someone healing, someone finally learning that her life held value. One afternoon, Lucy sat beside Walter near the edge of the canyon while stacks of paperwork rested across the small table between them. Property transfers, trust agreements, financial restructuring plans. Walter adjusted his glasses as Lucy reviewed another page carefully. "You're frowning again," he said lightly. Lucy sighed. "There's too much money, Walter." A quiet laugh escaped him. That may be the first honest complaint anyone's ever made about being wealthy. But Lucy wasn't joking. The hidden fortune still frightened her sometimes. Not because she wanted it for herself, but because she understood what it could become in the wrong hands. Or the right ones. She looked out across the mountains for a long moment before speaking softly. "I keep thinking about girls like me." Walter's expression softened immediately. Girls sleeping in cars. Girls aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. Girls pretending not to be afraid while walking alone at night because fear made them vulnerable. Lucy knew that life intimately. Too intimately. "I don't want this money to disappear into another business account," she whispered. "I want it to matter." Walter studied her quietly. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the following months, everything began changing faster than Lucy could have imagined. With Walter's guidance, the hidden fortune was transformed into something entirely new. Not luxury, not status. Purpose. The first project was small. A temporary housing shelter opened in a nearby town for abandoned young women with nowhere safe to stay. Lucy insisted the building feel warm instead of institutional. Soft lighting, real blankets, a kitchen that smelled like home instead of survival. Most importantly, no girl would ever be treated like a burden there. Walter watched silently the day Lucy stood near the entrance greeting the first arrivals. One girl looked barely 17. Another carried everything she owned inside a torn duffel bag. A third refused to make eye contact with anyone. Lucy recognized all of them instantly, because not long ago she had been every one of them. That night, after the shelter closed for evening intake, Lucy returned to the mountain cabin emotionally exhausted. Walter sat near the fireplace reading quietly when she entered. Without saying anything, Lucy crossed the room and hugged him tightly. The old man froze slightly in surprise. Then slowly, carefully, he hugged her back. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. But neither needed to. Because some people enter your life at the exact moment your soul is about to give up. And somehow, against all odds, they help rebuild the parts of you the world nearly destroyed. Months later, local newspapers began quietly publishing stories about the mysterious young woman funding shelters throughout the region. No one knew the full truth. No one knew about the hidden cabin on the cliffs, or the grieving old man who had once hidden himself away from humanity inside the mountains. Walter preferred it that way. But Lucy noticed something else changing too. Walter laughed more now. He spent less time staring silently at old photographs. The darkness he had carried for years no longer consumed every room he entered. Purpose had rescued him too. One evening during early autumn, Lucy found him standing alone outside the cabin, watching golden leaves drift across the canyon below. "You're thinking again," she said softly as she joined him. Walter smiled faintly. "Just remembering. Bad memories." He shook his head slowly. "No." His eyes glistened slightly in the fading sunlight, for the first time in a very long while. "Good ones." Lucy slipped her hands into the pockets of her jacket, while cold mountain wind moved gently around them. "I still don't understand why you trusted me," she admitted quietly. Walter looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because the first night you walked into this cabin," he said softly, "you looked at warmth before you looked at money." Lucy felt tears sting her eyes instantly. Walter smiled gently. Broken people recognize each other very quickly. The canyon below them glowed gold beneath the setting sun. And for a while, they simply stood there together in silence, not as strangers anymore. Not as a lonely old man and a homeless girl, but as two wounded souls who had unknowingly saved each other. Far below the cliffs, the world continued rushing forward as it always had. People chasing success, money, status, but hidden high within the mountains stood a quiet cabin that held a different truth entirely. Sometimes the greatest thing a person can discover isn't fortune. It's belonging. And for Lucy Granger, the girl who once believed nobody on earth wanted her, that hidden cabin on the cliffs had become the place where her life truly began. Lucy Granger thought losing everything meant her life was over. But sometimes losing everything is what finally leads you to the place you were always meant to find. Walter's fortune changed her future, but his kindness saved her life. Because people don't heal from money alone. They heal when someone finally makes them feel seen. In a world where so many people feel invisible, one moment of compassion can change someone forever. And sometimes the people who need love the most are the ones pretending they don't need anyone at all. There are people around us every day silently fighting loneliness, rejection, and hopelessness. You may never know what someone is carrying inside. A kind word, a warm meal, a second chance. For you, it may feel small. For someone else, it could become the reason they keep going.